Ken, it's so good to have you back on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me again.
It's wonderful to see you again, Ken. As I tell you, I keep talking about your stuff constantly, so it's really good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Richard.
Now, we've got you on the show because you've released a book that you've been working on for many a year. Tell us the title.
The title is Shame, Pride, and Relational Trauma, Concepts and Psychotherapy.
Wonderful. Now, I was just asking you before, how long did it take to write? And this has been a long-term project for you.
Yeah, I was calculating somewhere about 3.5, almost 4 years, but a lifetime before that. So you get to calculate which one you want to choose.
It's interesting how these things emerge over time. I remember one of the first books I wrote. I guess I was in my mid-40s, and my mum was a writer, and she was doing it. She popped off into the bedroom. She brought out a letter I'd written to her when I was 25. God, it helped me why she keeping letters. And she opened it up and turned to a paragraph and said, "Oh, there's the beginning of that idea, beginning of that thinking." And so, but we know you've been, despite the fact that it took you a while to put the words on paper, this is really a sort of an expression of a very long frame of work for you, throughout your career.
Absolutely. And I think I was writing sort of a form of a blog forum in the 2010. So that was where I started writing it, but just sort of trying out the ideas in writing with colleagues. But the people who are interested in shame are usually not interested in just for intellectual reasons. They have to have some life experience that said, oh, this is a tough one, and I better figure this out both for me personally, and then if you're a therapist, you really want to figure it out as well, because the way most people think about shame is as an emotion that comes and goes, like all emotions, and you get a rise and a fall. So, oh my God, I feel so embarrassed. And okay, I'd work through it, and okay, we're good to go. But the kinds of shame that shows up in psychotherapy when you're working with people who've experienced relational trauma, so that includes abuse of all kinds and neglect and sort of profound and pervasive failures to connect and bond for a caregiver with a child. Those kinds of people, while they may come in and have the experience of shame as an emotion, a kind of coming and a going, the tougher nut to crack, if you will, is shame as a traumatic mind-body state, or shame states. Judith Herman, the trauma expert, coined that term, and I was happy to borrow it. So that's what shows up in your office much more often. And that shame is is not unlike a flashback, like a mind-body state that takes over, and that when the person is in that state, it doesn't appear they're budgeable, and it certainly doesn't pass. They might have times where they're going along and they don't look like they're in that state at all. And then like a flashback, it hits them. And when they drop into it, that's the whole truth, nothing but the truth, always has been, always is, and always will be. And then some people live in a chronic state where they don't feel worthy of existing. There's actually a wonderful article called The Shame of Existing. This is much, much more profound. And you can imagine that both in when we're talking about traumatic states as an aspect of self that's been associated with shame, or one's whole being, you can imagine that that's much more difficult to work. And when therapists say, oh, I need help with working with shame, that's what they're usually talking about. They're not usually talking about moments where a person feels embarrassed. Oh, I shouldn't have done it. I really regret being that way. And they get over it. That's not typically the shame that most people want help with.
Yeah.
Yes. It is that. It's those emergent behaviors and sensations and activities that occur where shame is actually what underpins it, what underlies it. And it's interesting. My daughter's doing a lot of work at the moment and writing a fabulous book, See What You Made Me Do, which is, and we've talked to her about domestic violence and the presence of shame in the domestic violence cases, and of course we have it with the people who are suffering the violence, and which is more often than not women, and sort of in the male and some of the females that act it out, that comes from shame. You are shaming me, and so on and so forth. So shame has got a pervasive impact on a lot of different things that emerge out. And so you could have several different things going on in the room, different clients coming with different things, but you could find shame as being certainly a strong element of what's going on underneath. Is that sort of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. I'm hugely biased, but I think shame is lurking, and shame does lurk by definition. By the word origin of shame is to cover. So shame doesn't usually come out. Most people don't come to therapy and say, I'm here because I want to work on shame. In fact, they almost never say that. In fact, many people are clearly suffering from the effects of shame. We have to come to name it together. It's not something that they would think of. But that means if you believe that, then that means various forms of anxiety related to shame. Like, I'm afraid to put myself out there or else I will be. They don't always finish the I will be, but if they did, it would be some version of, it would show how terribly defective or damaged or disgusting or something fundamentally wrong with me. So there's anxieties, there's depression. The kind of hopelessness and despair that goes with depression is a natural consequence of traumatic shame. What you were referring to is a kind of shame rage or humiliation rage reaction. You humiliate me, I will humiliate you. That's not uncommon in people who are perpetrators of abuse. It's uncommon in certain political realms that we can look around the world right now. So, and when you think about that, like, you ask yourself the question, well, why would shame be so ubiquitous? It's like fear. Shame and fear are really kind of two tributaries, related tributaries that contribute to so-called psychopathology. And you sort of ask, well, why would that be? Why would shame be so central? Well, shame is fundamentally about the self. There's something fundamentally wrong with me as a person, not just I regret doing something. That's more associated with guilt. But shame is always about self in relation to other and self in relation to self. So if it's about self in relationship, other or with self, then how could it not be ubiquitous? Because, we're always bringing ourselves into some kind of interaction, either how I'm viewing myself, that would be self with self, or how I'm viewing you, or how you're viewing me, or how I'm viewing you, viewing me, viewing back and forth. So you would expect it to show up, and you would also expect it to show up because it's shame and pride are about valuation or devaluation. So we have a tendency as human beings, certainly as survival responses, but just generally, to compare and contrast. How do I measure up or measure down, if you will? How am I looked at with esteem, or how am I looked at as somehow less than? So these are sort of basic human qualities. So if you're dealing with self-other and valuation and devaluation, you would expect shame and pride to show up. Shame as a traumatic state tends to be hard to read. You have to kind of know, like, oh, is this performance anxiety a reflection of some fears of what will be exposed, about me as a person, which would be closer to shame. But pride is almost never talked about in the literature of psychotherapy and trauma. And when it's talked about, it tends to be spoken about in the guise of narcissism, narcissistic pathology, what's called hubristic pride, hubris. And it's rarely discussed in terms of that's a good thing. And you could say that's a cultural phenomenon, pride goeth before the fall. So, it's considered one of the 7 deadly sins. And there's, the Greek myth of Icarus. It's like, if you view that as an expression of hubris, like, I'm a teenager and I'm going to go as far as I can go. You tell me not to go to the sun. Yeah, I'm going to go to the sun. And then you crash. You could view that as one expression of hubris, and the punishments you get, in this case, death, if you become too full of yourself, so to speak. But in terms of pride as a sense of, there are different adaptive forms of pride. So The one that we most think of would be when you have a triumph or a success. So you worked at something hard and it really mattered to you. I wrote a book and I worked hard at it and I feel good about it, so I can feel some pride. And that's not arrogance. That's not one up. That's just a feeling of pleasure in accomplishing or mastering something. So a child who walks for the first time, they don't have the words, I'm proud, but you can just look like, I did it, because they've been seeing these big people walk around for a very long time. And it's like, that's not fair. I want to do that too. And when they achieve it, which is a lot of effort, you see the hard work they do to get to being able to walk, there's an intrinsic embodied sense of pride. So that's good stuff. And if you think about that in psychotherapy, particularly psychotherapy with relational trauma, it's hard work. It's hard work, particularly on the part of the patient, but also the therapist who's trying to figure out how best to help them, if you will, transform traumatic shame into adaptive pride. Then when you have these moments of success, and they're sort of intermittent, hopefully throughout the work, there's a sense of accomplishment and there's a sense of pride, and it then increases your ability to be motivated. Like, I did that, so maybe I can do some more, or we can do good work together. And it gives you a sense of hope and possibility. And Pierre Janet talked about the act of triumph. And if you read some of his descriptions of what the act of triumph is, it's about pride. It's about the achievement and the sense of pride in oneself and the work that follows.
Where does the concept of self-esteem fit in with what you're talking about in terms of pride?
So a sense of self as valued or valuable, as good or worthy of others' respect, that would be self-esteem or self-worth. Mm-hmm. There's a way, and I don't really know quite why it is, that the word self-esteem tends to not feel as full and embodied to me as the word pride or adaptive pride. It may just be particular to me, but often when people talk about self-esteem, they don't necessarily mention pride and shame. They talk about a self-esteem. So I'm not quite sure how it got divorced. I use the word shame and pride because it's about affect. It's about emotion, which is always including not only thoughts, feelings, embodiment, beliefs about the self, etc.
Yeah, because I get problems with language and semantics, and I kind of talk about words that have been stolen from us or been damaged. And in fact, we're having a lovely discussion about that in relation to what we do, the science. We're trying to rediscuss and get science away from being this reductionist thing and more into this expansive knowledge. And self-esteem, I think, is one of those words because it's become very strongly related to what is happening outside of yourself. So, as you say, it's a judgmental thing. I have high self-esteem if other people think I'm okay. But that sense of, you're saying, the pride, that one can have pride that's totally embraced around yourself. And that certainly the little child might sit there and say, hey, look, you guys all walk, now I can walk. I'm really proud of myself. But they can equally just simply be excited and then you bring in this word delight. I'm delighted in myself. Yeah, I'm pleased that everybody loves me and thinks I'm terrific and is giving me buns and chocolates and whatever it is because I walked. But just that self-engaged delight in self is the one that I find so beautiful that you talk about.
Right. So there's different, if you will, adaptive forms of pride. And the one I mentioned is, sense of accomplishment and mastery. And Nathanson writes about that back in the early 90s. But there's a term I developed, not the phenomenon, of course, but the term I developed, which I call pro-being pride, PRO-being pride. And since, you both are lovers of language, the reason that the way I came up with that term was I looked up the word origin of proud. So the word origin of proud goes back to a Latinate form, and it's spelled Prodesse. So I don't know how they would say it, but it would be some version of prodessa. That's my translation. Okay. So if you break it down, PROD means for, FOR. And ESSE means to be. So for being, or for one's essential nature. So what this means is this kind of pride is not an emotion. This is a mind-body state. We were talking about the traumatic mind-body state. This is an enduring, transformative mind-body state. And when I sort of thought about, well, how does one define being pro-being? The word I used is delight. And the best sort of example of this for me is when a child is born and they are welcomed into the family that they're welcomed, and not all children are, sadly, but when the child is welcomed, they come into the world and the parents or caregivers or aunts, uncles, or whoever goes, ah! And that's just delight. And the child has done nothing. I mean, really, the child was born. They certainly haven't, gotten their graduate degree in psychology, and they don't have to. And when you say, well, tell me about your child, they say, he or she is perfect. Well, come on. How could that be true? But they are, because there's something about the human to human delight, joy, pleasure in one's essential being. Because, quickly people start saying, well, he's like so-and-so and he's like so-and-so. It reminds me of, and that's true. But if you really think about it, he or she is his or her unique self. So to celebrate that is to be for, pro being. And I believe there's an essential quality of being human where we are celebrating ourselves. Really, you could say it's like celebrating life, but it's celebrating our unique way of being alive. So, and pro being has forms that are interrelational, right? That's a very interrelational experience. But then there's the experience of a relationship with oneself, where one takes a kind of intrinsic pleasure in one's unique way of being in the world. So that's intra-relational pro-being. And then if you extend it outward, and this will start sounding more spiritual, but I think it's basic to being human as well, then there's a basic delight in being alive and connected with all that is in the world. And I call that extra-relational pro-being, pride, but these are all expressions of a similar source. And the reason this is so important is there is no more powerful antidote to the traumatic shame than pro-being. If a person experiences themselves as alive and embodied and taking pleasure in their unique self, or if they can receive the therapist experiencing them that way, even in small ways, they cannot at that moment be in a traumatic shame state. It's not possible.
Because we're spending a lot of money and effort kind of buying that back. This sense with all these things, because it's been lost somewhere in the game. But as you've been describing it there, this many ways we've been saying it. So I just wanted to jump in with that, Matt.
Yeah. So as I'm listening to these concepts, for me, it begs the question, how universal is this? Do you notice cultural differences around the globe when it comes to shame and pride?
Well, I'm no cultural expert, so I can't answer that in definitive ways, but I can tell you it must be true, because I do not think, to use the example of the baby coming into the world, I certainly don't think that only happens in the United States or in Australia. That simply can't be true. And I am certain if I had a conversation with someone from fill in the blank, Tibet or Botswana or wherever it might be, and I try to describe something, they'd say, oh, we call that. Now, I have no idea what they would call that, but I don't think, I am 100% certain. That's why I said I came up with the term. I absolutely never came up with a phenomenon. And so this can't be particular.
This is the essence of being able to be responsive. I mean, we think in systems. I mean, the idea in systems, we have individual emergent elements, and that's to do with culture and society and so on and so forth.
Right.
But there are fundamental elements which we can kind of rely on throughout all cultures, and I think this is one of them. It emerges differently. Sure, the culture affects the way it's expressed.
Yes.
but it is very fundamental. That's why we're so keen to talk about the book today and tell people to go out and get it.
Yeah. There's some research that looks at what's going on in utero. And there's some research, Damasio talks about, I think it's Damasio talks about a proto-self. And there's some other research that tries to describe, well, what is this primal or proto-self? And one set of research, the first author's name is Delafield Butt, and the other name I absolutely can't pronounce. I think it's from an Indian heritage, but it talks about motoric intentionality. So what that basically means is they're looking at the fetus, I think around 4 or 6 months, something like that. And they're noticing that its movement has intention. I have no idea how one researches this, but it has intention. So the fetus wants to go from here to there, and you can get a sense motorically that's what they intended to do. It's not random movement. And the assumption is that motoric intentionality is an emerging property, if you will, of a proto-self, right? So this is long before people say, oh, now he has a sense of self. This is clearly long before that. This is purely embodied. Who knows what's going on in their quote unquote mind? And if you think of that motoric intentionality, you would assume it's unique to every organism, not just human organisms. But how can I move exactly the way you move or she moved, including in utero? Okay, because we are genetically different. I would assume it's even some motoric differences in twins, identical twins, but I have no idea. So if you believe there's an intention, there's something unique about the fetus that's demonstrable in the first months of life, then then celebrating that, taking pleasure in that is pro-being. And I have no idea what the infant feels in utero, but I'm imagining that's kind of cool to be able to move. So I don't know. I'm going to go with that's absolutely universal.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if we can get really pragmatic,
darn.
It was going so well, wasn't it?
You talked about the fact that, shame hides in the shadows, it covers. And so if we could just talk about some practical aspects of identifying shame, and then, sort of the process of what you've discovered to, work with it.
Yeah. Let's see. You can discover shame by what's avoided. That's one thing. There's a covering over, like, why are we never talking about your anger? Why are we never talking about sex? Or why are we never talking about your joy? Okay, so that would be one way to discover it, by its absence. If you think of it in terms of dissociation, structural dissociation, or just the experience of being not in contact with one's body, you should assume that there's an intimate relationship between shame and dissociation. I've written about this and it's complex, but you should assume that's somewhere there. Shame is a way to deaden, to take the life out of one's being, and dissociation has a similar effect, either sort of leaves the body or splits. So this aspect of self is deemed acceptable, and this aspect of self is deemed not, or shame related. So these are another ways. Sometimes it shows up in this way. If you study shame as an emotion, but also as a trauma state, if you just look at the process, like how do you go from I'm doing okay to dropping into shame? So one way to look at that is if you think of being okay as going on being. This is a Winnicottian term. So just like I'm going on being, you and I are doing our thing. We're going on being. And then something happens that interrupts that aliveness. It could be someone out of the blue calls me a horrible name. Or I did something, like I raised my hand and said something, and they said, really? Oh, really? That's what you had to say? Or sometimes it's about of a non-responsiveness. We tend to think of shame as what happens to someone. You little so-and-so, that's active shaming, but there's absence shaming, right? So you walk down the street and you see someone you haven't seen in a long time and you wave and they don't respond at all, okay? some people might get mad about that. I tend to feel ashamed, like, oh, what's wrong with me? Like,
what
do I
done?
not matter? Now, it could be that they didn't even notice you. They could not notice you. Some people will say, didn't you see me? Because they were upset. Like, no. And I'm sure they're relieved. Like, really? You didn't see me? No. But that non-responsiveness, which of course occurs when an infant or young child is quite young, if their parent is depressed, or if the parent has their own dissociation, if the parent has psychosis, or any number of things, there's going to be a non-responsiveness. So that's a long way of saying this. A lot of times what happens when the person feels shame is they first have what's called a shock. It's a jolt. And instead of dropping down in terms of arousal into shame, the first response is a rising. What follows is a dropping. So sometimes when we think of shame, we tend to think of it in terms of that shutting down, the energy dropping, the head turning, the whole body kind of going concave instead of sort of outward, which is more associated with aliveness or even pride. So we tend to think of it as that, why are you so depressed? Well, I feel terrible about myself. Okay, that would be a form of shame. But there's also the one that's sort of an anxious, that's the shock or the anticipated shock. If they see who I really am, then I have to make sure. So this would be a person who you can't get a word in edgewise, which happens with me a lot, but hopefully not always driven by shame. If you can't get a word in edgewise, well, that suggests there's some part of them that doesn't want you to see them, feel them, and know them in anticipation, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, that when you, quote, really see them, you will discover they have no worth, there's something wrong with them, they're not worthy of living, etc. So this is ways that I look for shame. I look for aspects of self that are deadened, covered over, dismissed, denied, or when a person talks about something they feel terrible about. Here's a real common one. People come into therapy, very common, and they say, what's wrong with me? Okay. Now, they come to therapy because, quote, they believe something is wrong with them. So the little mantra I like, because that's often related to shame. That's often the form of there's something wrong with me as a person, but they put it in the form of a question. So I tease them. I say, is that a question or an indictment? When it's an indictment, that's shame. But they don't. It's such a common thing. I can't believe I did that. What's wrong with me? That is such a ubiquitous expression. You wouldn't typically think there's shame there, and there is. So that's another way it might show up.
And this is what we talk about it in our recent book, and also I did in one before with Ernie Rossi, but that people come into the room, they say, I'm not okay. And then, of course, you do work with them, and they then say, oh, I feel okay now, and move on. And there's something very important in that, is that we actually prefer to feel okay. We actually prefer to not be shamed, be in a state of shame, or whatever it is, whether it's the shame state or whether it's biological issues, your gut's going off. And so therefore, and that I think is what is even more interesting as a fundamental element, that that having a sense of pride, having a sense of pro-being is actually a preferred state that we can move towards. And getting some kind of cognitive perception of this, of course, we certainly have all our inner implicit forces working, but this cognitive perception it can be really beneficial in our efforts to sustain and grow and engage ourselves. So, body up and, body to brain and brain to body. And so that's another reason why your work is so important, because it enables us to really simply and clearly get a sense of what it is that's not okay and why it is that it's not okay, and sort of some definition and verbalization of what is okay and what are some of the processes we can take to become okay. So I guess I'm sort of flattering again, but I just mean it in the sense of this. I alluded to it, but you've actually expanded and given form to what is not okay and what is okay, which I think is really powerful and important.
Right. And I was just thinking about sort of how it shows up, how shame shows up. Well, there's also how pride shows up. Usually pride shows up in ways that are fairly obvious if you're thinking in terms of pride. Most people don't, but person accomplished something and they feel really good about themselves. That's pride. They may not use that word, but that's what that is. And that motivates them to keep going. But if you think about pro-being pride, which again is more of a state than an emotion, the way that shows up, well, it first shows up by the person being uniquely themselves, but that doesn't mean they're aware of the experience and of pro-being. So you have your particular way of movement. I have mine. You use certain expressions. I have mine. I guarantee you, as I got to know you, I'd say I get a sense of who you are as a unique being. And then I would say, as I'm getting to know you, I might say, so I'm really getting a sense that you. And this could be my not just being okay with you being you. It could be my taking great pleasure or delighting in you being you, simply because you are you, which is pretty darn cool. Just like the infant that comes out of the womb. It's like, why should it stop at infancy, right? Why should it just say, well, you were cool at about birth?
Then you went off.
It's been downhill since then.
Yeah.
So then we're talking about some could be very subtle things. So it could be a unique choice of words. It could be the way the person tilts their head. It could be they're going along and they're quite depressed, and yet they have a moment, a glimmer of a spark or aliveness. So if that shows up in the room, which it always will if you pay attention, it even can show up in the particular form in which they had to adapt to trauma. So they have a unique way of adapting. Not everyone adapts to the same quote unquote traumatic event the same way. So if you can think about even the so-called psychopathology as unique expression, even if it comes out in a sort of twisted way of the person's being, then you can take interest and pleasure in that. And when you do, I often say to someone as I'm kind of getting a sense of who they are, I describe something about them and they feel really seen. And I said, I bet if I interviewed your closest friends, they would all say the same thing. And they always say yes. Now, what do I know about them that all the friends know? Well, I know about something about them as a person. And having a sense of you as a person, right? That you have these people, not just your therapist who quote unquote is paid to be nice, right? So I'm genuinely interested in you as you are, unique way of being yourself. And I'm genuinely interested because I'm not just saying the words I'm interested. I'm excited, or I'm just present in a way that we're feeling each other. Right? We're in sync somehow in an energetic or embodied way. You can't fake that. You can't, and a person who's on the receiving net who can receive it, some trauma survivors, it's harder for them to receive it because that sense of closeness or intimacy was experienced as resulting in abuse, neglect, abandonment. But if you can receive it, it's undeniable. And there's no place for shame to be held in that place. There's just none.
Yeah. So we're trying to identify threads of pro-being pride and bringing that forward, amplifying that. Is that what we're trying to do here?
Yes, absolutely. And if you sort of feel this way about human beings, right? It's not something you read in the book, but as you hold it in your mind, you think, well, yeah, people are pretty cool. I mean, not like you like them all, they're just like interesting, right? Right? You are different than Richard. And I guarantee you, if people said, Richard, Matt, they work in the same place, right? So they're the same. I'm like, they're not. They're clearly not. And each of you has your own unique qualities. So I will find things as I talk with both of you that I find interesting. And then I want to know more. And I'm not doing this as a therapy technique. In fact, I have a little section of one of my chapters. It's about certain kind of attitudes or principles or concepts that guide the work. And my first One of those is there's no such thing as shame and pride psychotherapy. I'm like, well, how could that be? You wrote a whole book about it. There better be something about it. But there isn't in the sense of being seen, felt, known, recognized, to use Bromberg's term, recognition. You can't fake that. I write a little bit in my book about a person who goes to therapy, and they have dealt with a depression for many years, and they're feeling really terrible as they enter the therapist's office, and the therapist smiles. And the therapist has a particular quality of smile. They just sort of beam. It's like their pro-being is just happy to see this person, okay? It's hard to experience that kind of smile and still feel crappy about yourself. I mean, it doesn't mean you don't have something to work on, but who is this person that finds me delightful? He's not saying, oh, you're not that bad. No, he or she smiled at me. How could that be if I'm feeling so horrible? So that's an example of such a small way. And trust me, if you ask that person years later, what do you remember about the therapist? Oh, there was that one time he or she smiled.
Yeah.
It's like, really? Yeah. I thought it was my great interpretation. Oh, it was your smile.
That reminds me of some of the work that HeartMath did on the radiation of our heart, and how we have to be, come from an honest, heartfelt, because we electromagnetically radiate that, and that modulates the other person's brain waves, and so you can't fake it. You have to be.
No, you can't fake it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because my granddaughter's coming up to around 5 years of age. I'm thinking of theory of mind. I'm thinking of this development of the mental capacity to understand the difference between myself and others, and I can see that happening to her. And I'm just looking in this idea of, have you put any thoughts to that? This nature of the pro-being, is it amplified, or does it become formulated in around this? Has it got some relationship to theory of mind at all?
Okay, so you had asked me a question I never thought of, so I'll have to play with that one. So I would say, okay, here's what I would say. When people talk about shame, the developmental researchers, not all, of course, but many of the developmental researchers say, well, it comes online about somewhere between 2 and 3. Okay. And it comes online when the person has, quote unquote, self-consciousness. And self-consciousness is closer to self-other consciousness. Oh, you're looking at me in a particular way, so therefore, in some way, I am the you who views me that way, or this kind of reflecting back like mirrors. Okay, so you'd say, well, and in fact, self-conscious emotions include shame and pride and guilt. That's usually the categories of self-conscious emotions. So the developmental researchers, these particular ones that I'm mentioning, say somewhere between 2 and 3. Then that might relate to, okay, I get a sense that you have a mind. I get a sense that, because, you could say, well, at the very young age, the child thinks their mind and my mind is the same. So if you look at me negatively, then I am. That's the whole story. Not you're in a bad mood, or you woke up on the wrong side of the bed. So theory of mind gets more complex, as you start thinking about, is it an accurate reading of the other person's mind? But if you think about this at the more organismic level, right? Colin Trevarthen writes about shame and pride in the first year of life. There's a wonderful quote about this. It's like, well, how can that be? Well, it fits if you think of it more in terms of one's being, not one's cognition. So the developmental researchers say later. Theory of mind, I would assume, develops, quote, later. And this experience of self as valued or devalued, self as worthy of being alive or not worthy of being alive, that has to come much earlier.
Yeah.
And that self is not worded. So that's why you quote, it's harder to research, because how do you research what can't be worded? Although there's some research that shows in the first year of life, if a baby could do something, like get they do a thing where they look a certain place and the thing swirls around them when they look, these very young infant research. Well, let's say the baby make the thing swirl. It's pretty cool. So now I have some way of affecting the world. That's pride. again, implicitly. If you prevent them from doing it, like they look and the thing doesn't swirl, even though they looked in the right spot, this is what happened. They go like this.
Yes.
And we're talking the first year of life. So is that shame? I'm going to say yes. Who would know? But I would say yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, that development of quite a grasp onto a lot of what you're saying. That early, that non-conscious, that non-verbal state. The theory of mind change is not something like a switch. And I've always thought it really begins in that around 2 as language begins to emerge, and then eventually, I noticed my little granddaughter, she would be trepidatious about things that she was unsure of, and I would think that was part of shame and pride. I don't know whether I'll do it, a sense of self. But now she's expressing an interesting thing where she's moving into the area of being someone that is better than or less than. So suddenly we find if she loses a game, she's having reactions now that are different than she had a little while ago. So
right.
it's really interesting to watch these, and I'm going to make sure my daughter has a little look at this presentation, because it's really important in getting a grasp of what we're working with. It's not about behaviors, it's about these, although they're important, of course, and you can teach
right.
some of those, but what's the underpinnings that we're allowing to develop.
Right. And, I was just thinking, the Tronick's still face paradigm.
I was thinking of him too, yeah.
Where an infant, usually they're like young, 9 months, 12 months, whatever. And they come in with the parent, usually it's the mother in these research products that I've seen. And they have presumably a secure attachment. So they have a really good bond. And you watch these little interactions and they're just like adorable, right? So the mother does this and the baby does that. And you have this little dance going, and it's mostly nonverbal. And if they make words, it's mostly, like motherese. The baby goes, and does the same thing in their way, right? And so there's not a lot of words, but there's a lot of emotion and embodiment and energy, right? And so they're doing great. And then the researcher says, mom goes still face. So then the mother turns away and comes back
still.
Mm-hmm. It's torture. If you watch it, I experience it as torture. In fact, I think, why are you doing this research? It's really painful to watch.
Yeah, please stop.
And if you watch what happens, first of all, the baby tries to do what he or she did. Well, that's not working. Well, so then baby gets more aggressive. That's not working. So anger is not working. Then the baby gets frustrated and confused and almost disorganized. That's not working. And what eventually happens is the baby collapses. Mm. Now, one could let's just imagine that your mother or father was repeatedly non-responsive. Okay, I'm not talking about abusive. I'm talking about non-responsive. I know people who've experienced loss in their lives. No one talked about the loss. There was no going to a funeral. There was no, you must miss your special friend or your sibling or your dog. There's none of that. And so you could think of that as a repeated daily experience of still face, right? I've had people, they say, I came home from school. What happened? Nothing. What do you mean, what happened? Well, my mom was on the phone chatting. My father later came home and read the newspaper. Okay, this is not abuse, but the child comes to believe they don't matter. How do you know you matter? Because you walk into the room and someone says, hey, why? I didn't do anything. Yeah, you did. You walked into the room. Hey, how was your day? Sometimes you ask, how's your day? And what you're really saying is, tell me about you. How did it go? How'd that test go? What's going on with Joey, who was not nice to you yesterday? How are you? What matters to you? That's basic to being human and taking interest in someone. You don't have that. You're walking shame without knowing it. You'd have no idea. And these are the people, when they say, tell me about your childhood, they say, well, what's to tell? Well, what happened? Regular family.
Usual stuff.
Usual stuff. These are people in the attachment research. They say they don't have a coherent narrative. Well, they almost don't have a narrative. There's like, it's not even incoherent. It's sort of like it's not there. Those are the people who are living with the effects of shame, often without any awareness. What they might express is feeling somewhat detached. I have a hard time getting motivated. It's hard to really feel engaged. I do what I do, but it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, really think about it existentially. Does it really matter?
Yeah, that ambivalent thing. Yeah.
Or more the absence of.
And the absence, yeah.
The absence, yeah. So that would be, to me, an expression of the shame that's a consequence of not being responded to, just in the most basic of ways.
Wow, this is such important subtleties to keep in mind. I mean, we probably always think about the obvious traumas, but we're in recent times where parents are often caught up in social media and just generally disengaged. I remember watching a video of a mother. I think Louis Cozolino was showing us that, Richard. And the mother was just totally disengaged from the baby, on her phone. And this is pervasive.
Right.
Ed Tronick and Lou are going to be in Australia towards the end of the year. So people might, the Childhood Foundation, they might go have a...
You should ask Ed Tronick if I remember this research correctly, because I heard him present once and I was like, this is unbelievable. So ask him if this is true. He talked about the child who experienced the situation where the mother, the still face. Yeah. And then the child comes back, 9 months later or a year later, and they monitor cortisol levels, and the cortisol level seems to increase when they approach the research room. And as though they had, something, if not traumatic, something really quite disturbing that their bodies remember. Now, that may be a wonderful, fanciful memory of mine. So you can ask him.
I'll try to do it privately. The big question.
Yeah. Did you create Room 101?
That's right.
Exactly. Don't go there.
I just want to chime a little bell on an important word which is really important to me. Is this word you said there, responsiveness.
Yes.
That this is so much. In fact, I'm going to go and do some PhD work on this in therapy and in process. But we've learned how to sort of center people to client-centered, which is really give them some level of importance. But it is this fabulous. What we need is responsiveness. We want to walk into a space and for our energy to have an interaction, for us to get the sense that we are there. And, we see so many behaviors. I mean, one of my favorite behaviors of young kids around 7 or 8, 9 years old, and they've just got a push bike, and they will park the bike in the doorway. And people will say, oh, these kids are so rude and they're so thoughtless and everything else. And I go, to an extent, but they're also saying, I'm here. You have to notice me. You may not see me because I'm small, but you can't get past my bike, so you'll have to get cranky with me or something of the. So this and we'll take negative responsiveness. We'll take being yelled at by our parents, rather than having them. The wonderful story of the kid whose mother had 3 jobs and he was just impossible behavior. And eventually they got down and the little kid said, well, if I'm impossible, Mum has to come to school. She has to talk to me. She has to punish me. Otherwise, if I'm good, she goes to bed and goes to sleep. And so they just arranged a simple bit of responsiveness.
This whole thing we talk about, kids trying to get attention. It's like it almost becomes cliche, like, oh, you're just trying to get attention. Yeah, you're trying to get attention. I want to know that I exist and that I matter. So we're, quote, all seeking attention. I was thinking about that bike. Yeah, I was thinking about the bike, right? So just imagine the kid's got the bike right across the doorway and the parent comes home. And, I understand parents tired, so I'm not expecting parents to do this. But just imagine the parent comes home and says, hey, Joey, this is a really cool bike. This is like an amazing bike. And I really like the way you have it right in front of the doorways. I can't miss it. I'm having an idea that you've had some adventures on this bike lately. Did you have any adventures today on your bike? Now, obviously, come on, I don't expect people to always respond that way, but could you imagine responding that way? The kid be like, oh, well, actually, I did. I crashed my bike. Oh, that's why it's a little dented there. Yeah, Dad, can you help me? Or Mom, can you help me fix it? Yeah. Well, I'm so glad then you told me. I wouldn't have known you had an accident, right? So this is like, we're going about the bike, but the implicit message is, if the bike matters to you, the bike matters to me because you matter. So now we're back to taking delight.
Yeah. And that's a great possibility, that we often miss because we're trying to be ordered rather than responsive. So I just can't think of anything. I talk about delight, that being delighted. I showed someone my book the other day, the new book. It was really great, and they said, "Oh, I couldn't read this." This bit. So they were expressing their shame instead of having some delight in my delight that I produced a book. It was. And I'm thinking of you again. I think, oh God, I got to tell Ken that because. But I really can't recommend this stronger or more highly as a way of, you've done so much of the work to help us get a grasp and an understanding and this cognitive perception of these things that are going on deep within us now we see potentially in utero. So please, everybody, go out and get a look at this stuff. Come into the Science of Psychotherapy. We've got some fabulous articles. If you just want to read something shorter from Ken, this is something that means a lot to me. And I think it will mean a lot to others, to Matt and me.
Yeah. And once again, Ken, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Any final words before we wrap this up?
This is here's my final words. It actually has to do with you guys.
Uh-oh.
Okay. See, he got a little worried.
That's right. Straight away.
I'm not going to make a big deal about it, but maybe after we can talk, Richard. But this has to do with you guys because I had read what was then the neuropsychotherapist before I even made any contact with you. And I don't know when it was that I first sent something to you, but trust me, I was nervous. And I was nervous because this is important to me. I'm writing about something that is important to me, not just as a therapist, but a person. So anyone who cares about their writing knows they're putting themselves out there, not just their writing, something essential about who they are. So I'm putting myself out there, and I have no idea whether you'll even consider it, much less publish it. And you guys have been great. You have been very supportive of things that I've written. You've taken interest in it. You made them look really good on a page with cool pictures, that I would never have come up with. And as a result, I've built my own confidence. So you could say I felt some more pride and even sort of the pleasure that I take in being a writer. So it helped me with the initial doubts and probably lingering shame of, is there something about my writing or my ideas that will be, not necessarily criticized, just like, well, whatever. Or is there genuine interest? You guys have always shown interest. So that's built a sense of my confidence as a writer. And I'm grateful for that. So thank you.
Okay. Well,
it's the interpersonal thing. We need each other and we value from each other. Yeah, very true.
I think, because firstly, we're empathic humans. Secondly, we're psychotherapists. And then thirdly, we're publishers. So,
it's a trifecta.
Yes.
Anyway,
right.
we'll have to wind it up now. Matt, as glorious, we could go on forever. But Ken, thank you so much for taking the time with us again, and for taking the time to put these words down on paper so you can people can share in the joy of this and take delight in the whole thing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you. Bye-bye.